And thank you all for joining us today for the final webinar of our Climate Change and Human Rights webinar series, Changing Borders, Climate Rights and the Future, with Professor Simon Dalby from the Balsillie School of International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University. My name is Megan Reed and I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the Zorian Institute, and I will be the moderator for today's session. A few housekeeping items before I give our host a proper introduction today. If you've missed any of our past webinars from this series, you can access the recordings on our website, and my colleague Allison will be sharing the link to this for you in the chat box soon. And if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box or use the raise your hand function at the end of the presentation. We will be allocating about 20 minutes or so for a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. If you have any specific questions for the Institute, please ask them in the chat box, or you can always send us an email to admin@genocidestudies.org. So now I would love to introduce our presenter today. Professor Simon Dalby is a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, where he teaches in Balsillie School of International Affairs and is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. He is co-editor of Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and author of Anthropocene, Geopolitics, and Rethinking Environmental Security. So Professor Dalby, thank you so much for joining us today for this presentation.
Okay, well, thank you for that welcome. I've got myself a title here on Changing Borders, Climate Rights in the Future. I do intend to talk a little bit about all of these themes: changing borders, then climate, the future, and rights will come near the end in terms of wrapping up my presentation. So without further ado, let me just say a few things about my own background. I am a geographer technically, and of course geopolitics has been something I have been thinking about for a long time. The classic text from nearly 20 years ago now, John Agnew's Geopolitics volume. The slightly fuzzy image here, of course, is very appropriate because this is the Berlin Wall, or was the Berlin Wall, and it's all now a little fuzzy in history. But clearly, when we're thinking about boundaries and thinking about geopolitics, this is, of course, the iconic image, literally building a wall through the middle of a city, and thinking about the politics that go with the barrier to movement. The fixity of boundaries is literally set in concrete in this iconic image. The graffiti artists, of course, had a field day with it because, well, it's a lovely big wall for making your artistic and political comments on. All of which suggests that we need to stop and think about whose image, how we visualize borders, and what the political consequences of them might be, by way of a sort of an introduction, thinking about questions of genocide a little later in the talk. Because geopolitics isn't just about the material realities of borders, it's also very much about how we visualize the world, how we see the world, and the knowledge practices that we bring to bear on that world in terms of how we understand it, how we map it, and the consequences of, well, exactly that, how we map it. The world order of the last 60, 70, little more than that years now, of course, epitomized by the Berlin Wall, was one in which we assumed that the world order would be structured around a series of fixed borders. The lines on the map were supposed to be stationary. They were supposed to stay where various, often colonial administrations had imposed them. And indeed, at the heart of the United Nations systems in particular was what Mark Zacher famously called the territorial integrity norm. International boundaries and the use of force. The whole idea in the United Nations system, indeed it's so obvious that until recently most of us have simply taken for granted, was that boundaries were actually fixed, and using force to change them was not something that was acceptable as an international norm. And so geopolitics was about a world in which the boundaries were fixed. And yet over the last few decades, clearly the dominant processes in the world were all about interconnections. Globalization is about connections. In this image, one of the many ones that Globaya folks constructed over the last decade. Cities, roads, railways, transmission links, pipelines, shipping lanes, submarine cables, flight routes were all connected in frantic, speedy, speeded up world, where the administrative boundaries, those fixed territorial boundaries, are frequently having a dreadful time actually trying to govern these flows and connections. So we had this world in which globalization was the dominant social and economic process, and yet an administrative structure based on fixed boundaries. And so geopolitics is all about the contradictions and the difficulties when you've got flows and connections being governed by fixed boundaries. Or as I like to say it, we have got topological processes being governed by topographic mechanisms. We're all familiar with how this gets represented. This one I like because it's a partly translated Italian version of the world map. I say partially translated because when you look at across the map, some of it's in English and some of it's in Italian. But the point about this is that this is the taken for granted vision of the world. We have precisely demarcated states which are seen to be separate. The borders are supposedly fixed, and yet so much that matters crosses those borders. So many flows and connections that make our lives possible pay little attention to these borders, that the context in which we now think about things is a muddle, to put it mildly, because governance and borders and flows and connections get all mixed up. How we visualize the world is a combination, of course, of these things. And that's sort of the backdrop in which we now have to face the real question. Well, if those norms of fixed borders no longer hold, as we are all being painfully reminded in the news in the last few weeks, where Russian troops are attempting to forcibly change the borders and causing lots of anxiety. First off in 2014, when Crimea changed hands peacefully, although forcefully, and now in the appalling war in Ukraine. And of course, much of the concern has been, well, if we don't stop Russia in Ukraine, next will be Poland or Romania or the Baltic states. But of course, at the back of this, the larger question about how we govern the planet and the territorial fixity norm is really what is being challenged by the existing wars. And of course, the disruptions that are likely to happen as a result, or are already happening as a result of that awful violence in the Ukraine. Is it in fact an attempted genocide on the Ukrainian population? One might argue that Putin's refusal to accept that there isn't a Ukrainian people fits that discussion. I want to leave that point aside, although it's probably worth remembering, to suggest that in fact we have large numbers of refugees from the war already heading across Europe, but simultaneously we have large discussions about sanctions, financial flows, and where are those Russian oligarchs' super yachts actually sailing to now, and where are they registered, and. This is an old cartoon from a while ago, but it does seem to be tragically relevant, because while people are on the move, so is money, or in some cases, the money isn't on the move or attempts to stop it escaping, has been part and parcel of the conflict over the last few weeks, nearly a month now. And it's the contrast between what can flow in which direction that of course makes borders crucial to how governance actually works these days. Do you have a visa? Do you have a bank account? Can you transfer your money or not? Will SWIFT no longer operate for crucial institutions in Moscow? And borders are being reimposed, or in the case of Ukrainians moving to Europe, being opened. And of course, borders are thence, despite the fact that it's all about flows and connections, a crucial part of understanding the contemporary changes in our present circumstances. The war is causing prompt casualties, and those pictures from the Ukraine horrify me and probably everybody else who's listening to me. But some of the more indirect effects may be worth paying some attention to in coming weeks, because of course the bread baskets of Europe are in the Ukraine and part of Russia, and wheat imports from both countries are of course crucial to feeding large parts of Africa, and Egypt in particular. Those of us who remember back to 2010 and the beginnings of the Arab Spring, one of the connections was, of course, the rapid rise in food prices in the Middle East as a result of the ban on exports of wheat from Russia because of the fears of a bad harvest in Russia in 2010. Are we going to see such displacements of food systems and hunger on the part of various populations in Africa later this year if the crops don't get planted in the Ukraine and Russia because of the disruptions of war, or later they don't get harvested? This is one of those sort of issues which may well come back to haunt us later this year. And of course, in terms of questions of starvation and the unintentional destruction of large numbers of people because of starvation, this is one of the issues that we do need to think. And again, it's the flows being disrupted, the imposition of borders as a result of the war that is a part of what we need to bear in mind in coming months. Will we see large numbers of refugees once again attempting to flee Africa, crossing the Mediterranean? And if so, what kind of border will they find? A naval series of patrols in the Mediterranean, turning them back when they are seeking sanctuary in Europe? And if so, what kind of consequences for refugees will we see later this year? But what I want to turn my attention to now, with that as a backdrop, is that arching the processes of globalization and the imposition of governance using bordering mechanisms is the long-term trajectory, which is accelerating, of climate change. You've all seen that diagram, or at least anybody who's been paying attention to the news over the last decade or two certainly has been seeing this diagram. It's the rapidly rising carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, usually measured at Mauna Loa Observatory, that big volcano in Hawaii. Stop and think about that. Yes, you've seen it, but no, stop and think about it. Where were you on this? Let me rephrase that sentence. When did you appear, and what was the parts per million when you were born? Stop and think about it, because you're part of this graph. Every time you fire up your furnace or drive your car, you are adding carbon dioxide into this. And this really is the graph of our times. And yes, full disclosure, if my mother's calculations had been correct, I would have appeared more or less exactly the week they started making these measurements in 1958. I was a bit enthusiastic to get on with things, so I'm a couple of weeks early, but there we are. But if you stop and think about where you fit into this, and stop and think about how much the planet has actually changed in terms of literally the air we breathe. We do not breathe the same air as our grandparents did. Some of you who are born more recently than me are breathing air that is subtly different from what I was breathing when I first appeared. We are literally changing the composition of that crucial gas. It's very small quantities, but it absorbs heat, and hence the planet is warming. We are living in a world that isn't just a matter of borders and globalization in terms of flows, but is also beginning to change some fundamental parameters of the geological circumstances, which is why we are increasingly talking about a planet which is now in the period of the Anthropocene, literally the new geological circumstances, because clearly human fingerprints are increasingly obvious in how the Earth system operates. Mostly we are concerned about climate, mostly we are concerned about carbon dioxide and the heating consequences of that gas. But there's much more to the Anthropocene than just the rise in carbon dioxide, although it is the key greenhouse gas that we are all particularly worried about. Let me just focus on this book. These guys, Lewis and Maslin, have been writing about the Anthropocene and the history of the planet for the last decade or so at least. And this little book from Pelican, what is it now, 4 years ago, is if you want to understand the Anthropocene, this is the book to read. Well, it's one of the 2 books to read. But what's really interesting about Lewis and Maslin, to the topic of our talk today and the links to genocide, is their suggestion, and it's still being argued about by the scientists, but their suggestion in this particular graph, which is a sort of a long historical version of what you have, what you just saw. This goes back 1,000 years, but their suggestion is that in fact the carbon dioxide concentration graphed here on the right-hand side of the graph, and basically what you saw in my previous graph is sort of the bit that follows on from this on the right-hand side. But what they're arguing is that the average temperature of the planet, of course, follows greenhouse gases, although there's usually a bit of a lag. In other words, the gases change before the temperature changes. That's not true at the end of ice ages, but that's another technical question. But over the last few thousand years, clearly there is a very discernible relationship between the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the global average temperature. And if you look at this diagram, what they're suggesting is that the carbon dioxide, less carbon dioxide means cooler temperatures. More carbon dioxide means warming temperatures. Of course, there's a lag effect because the system takes a while to follow the lead of the carbon dioxide levels. The crucial point here they're suggesting is that the lowest period or the lowest concentration of carbon dioxide is the period the beginning of the 17th century. And in terms of tracking the concentration back through the centuries, the lowest period is actually 1610. What they call the Orbis hypothesis suggests that in fact this is a response by the planetary system to the destruction of indigenous cultures in North America and South America. The Americas basically had many, many millions of people until the Europeans showed up. And then anything up to 60, 80 million people, some estimates go as high as, died off in the aftermath of European colonization. If ever there was a massive kill, the Great Dying, as they call it in some of their other publications, this was surely it. The consequences, of course, were absolute devastation for the native peoples. And we, to this day, usually start a talk with a land acknowledgement about the people's land that we are speaking on. It's a little tricky when you're doing a webinar with people from all over the place actually attending. But the crucial point to connect up with the land acknowledgements is that the land was dramatically changed ecologically by the Great Dying. What happened, of course, is that lots of agricultural areas were simply abandoned because there was nobody left to tend the fields or herd the flocks. The result being that massive tree growth happened, reforestation, and effectively sucked carbon dioxide out of the global atmosphere. So the argument that they make is the reverse of the normal discussion that will climate change cause serious human rights violations up to the scale of genocide. The argument here, of course, might be that genocide has already, in fact, caused climate change, because the trajectory down through the 17th and 18th centuries, at the so-called Little Ice Age, the worst of the Little Ice Age in Europe, with all the political disruptions that came from that, may in fact have been an indirect consequence of the destruction of native peoples in North America in the previous century. And so the consequences of that, whether you want to call it genocide or not, but the massive destruction of indigenous societies in these continents may in fact have slightly but noticeably changed the trajectory of the global climate in the period of the Little Ice Age, with all the ramifications this has for social change in Europe, and also the massive famines and disruptions across Asia and much of the rest of the world too in that period, which Jeffrey Parker's book on global crisis a decade ago documented in extraordinary detail. The point about the Anthropocene then, of course, is that the human fingerprints are all over how the Earth system operates. And that's the context in which we now need to think about both borders and climates and refugees and the rights of people in a dramatically altered world which we are increasingly dramatically altering, sometimes deliberately and sometimes, as in this case, completely unintentionally having dramatic consequences. But this is why this notion of the Anthropocene is so intriguing, because clearly human actions on the global scale have changed things in ways that we may not have realized until very, very recently. It's not just climate change. We have also, of course, colonized numerous parts of the world. And again, the land acknowledgement thing recognizes the fact that, that in many cases, European colonists have disrupted and moved indigenous populations in numerous parts of the world over the last few centuries. But one of the other consequences, of course, has been what the international ecological folks, the biodiversity and ecosystem services folks, talk about an unprecedented species extinction rate, dramatic ecological disruptions, killing off large numbers of animals, moving plants around in vast amounts. Just think of the origins of whatever's in the nearest garden to where you're sitting. Think about the rabbits to Australia, horses around the world, potatoes to Europe, from Peru, all sorts of dramatic ecological consequences. And this is another good reason for thinking about the Anthropocene, but because clearly natural evolution, sort of Darwinian style, is no longer operational in anything like the scale that one might expect, because the artificial movement and mixing of species has changed the ecological context so dramatically, including making us vulnerable to various viruses, as this awful COVID pandemic should have reminded us one more time. All of which suggests that we are in a novel set of circumstances which are potentially very dangerous. And it raises the questions of what kind of boundaries and borders in all this really matter most in this increasingly artificial world. Well, Greta Thunberg has some ideas. And juxtaposing her with Donald Trump, I was just explaining to my students a minute ago why it's never a good idea to put large amounts of text on a slide when you're doing a presentation. So here I am breaking my own basic rule. People are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. That's the IPBES slide I just showed you. In the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? She does have a way with words, does Miss Thunberg. The contrast the following day from He Who Shall Remain Nameless is the future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. My argument here is that Greta Thunberg is actually talking about what are now increasingly called the planetary boundaries in Earth system science, whereas Trump is, of course, oh, I did mention his name. Trump is, of course, talking about traditional notions of territorial boundaries in which patriots defend and celebrate their own particular identities within fixed territorial boundaries, whereas it's the Earth system or the planetary boundaries that Thunberg is particularly worried about. And indeed, those two quotes set up the paper that I did trying to flesh out this argument last year in Borders and Globalization Review. If you want the sources on a lot of this, go check out that. It's open access, just click on the link and it's all yours. The point being that there's two fundamentally different notions of boundaries involved here. One is the territorial boundaries of traditional states. The other, which we increasingly need to pay attention to, is the boundaries of ecological systems. How far we can push the Earth system without it flipping into new, potentially disastrous configurations. And yes, land system change I've just mentioned. We use quite a lot of fresh water. We're using enormous quantities of artificial fertilizers. And so phosphorus and nitrogen are completely out of whack with what the traditional natural world would have been. We messed up the strategic, the stratospheric ozone layer very badly in the middle of the 20th century, and that one we more or less fixed, or at least it is fixing itself, as the chlorofluorocarbons, which we no longer produce, are gradually dissipating in the atmosphere. We have changed all sorts of other things, and we've introduced what they call novel entities, all sorts of pollution into the atmosphere and so on. The whole idea of this is that the inner circle there is the sort of safe operating space for the planet Earth, and we are transcending those boundaries in numerous increasingly dangerous ways. This is the context of the Anthropocene, which requires us to think seriously about where the Earth system is headed. And these disruptions, in this case mostly climate ones, are superimposed on the extinction problem, but also superimposed on increasingly artificial environments. We have deforested, we have spread farms and cities. All those connections that I talked about are in increasingly artificial world. And the climate change is playing out on that artificial world. And of course, it's that context that makes people insecure. It's that context which may require people to move, and yet the boundaries that we have constructed make moving difficult frequently for people who very much need to do so. It's also, of course, a question of migration of other species as well. The reason why the Earth system people get so upset about all of these is because it isn't any one particular aspect. It's the fact that they're all interconnected in various ways. And this little graphic is suggesting that as we heat the planet, increasingly we'll flip some of these systems into different configurations with cascading and more or less unpredictable interactions. And avoiding that is part of what we are trying to do, because can societies survive in a disrupted and increasingly unpredictable and dynamic system? And that's, of course, the really big question, because if people have to move, if people are getting increasingly impacted by disruptions in the Anthropocene, then how do our governance structures respond? Can they respond? And it's that context that we really do need to think about much more carefully, because the assumption of stable boundaries, both in terms of states and in terms of ecological function, neither of those things hold anymore. Welcome to the Anthropocene. While everybody was paying attention to the Ukraine over the last couple of weeks, some of us were paying attention to the extraordinary temperature anomaly in Antarctica. And yes, the Arctic has been behaving kind of weirdly too. I mean, just look at that red line and compare it with the pattern that has been tracked over the last many years. We are seeing some really weird weather in Antarctica, way off the charts. And this, of course, is precisely what worries the Earth system scientists, that increasingly unpredictable weather patterns are going to destabilize the relatively stable climate system that we have known through human history, leading us to a world in which we're going to have to think about all sorts of things, including the potential of this kind of climate disruption to cause all sorts of war, migration, and disruption. The argument a decade ago was that, in fact, climate may have been one of the causes of the Syrian civil war. People set in motion in eastern Syria, going to the cities, causing trouble, being repressed by the Assad regime. Was climate change actually the cause of the drought in eastern Syria, which set people in motion, which in turn caused all this violence? That was at least the initial thought, because it appeared that the drought was very severe and had caused this. Careful social science research subsequently has suggested that it's a much more complicated story. And in fact, there were more severe droughts in Syria earlier than this, which didn't cause mass migration, much less a civil war. So in fact, the record on this is really difficult. And in fact, poor governance, poor agricultural policies on the part of the Assad regime may in fact have been a much larger contributing factor than climate. Nonetheless, it is quite clear that major disruptions to food supplies, whether it's from war in Ukraine and Russia, or from increasingly unpredictable harvests, which Africa's already been suffering from, may well cause all sorts of human suffering, and may well cause attempts on the part of numerous people to migrate in ways that are hard to predict in advance, precisely because you don't know which crops in which country when are likely to fail. But this is increasingly concerning security thinkers in numerous parts of the world, and indeed wondering about what kind of consequences this will have for war, conflict, security, and whether migrations will in fact cause all sorts of further political instabilities in the coming future. And indeed, the nightmare scenario from a decade ago in Howard Welzer's book was we will become more or less used to this. The assumption is that there will be conflict and arguments over scarce food supplies and migration across much of the global south. And his sort of moral nightmare is that this actually will become the new normal, and that this is what we are actually facing later in this century. Avoiding such outcomes would seem to me to be absolutely crucial to the future and to dealing with likely human impacts. If we are in fact facing a climate emergency, and many governments, including the federal government in Canada, have declared states of climate emergency, then it's time to rethink how we deal with people, how we deal with their care, and how we deal with the multiple insecurities that we are currently facing. This being a wildfire in Australia outside a seniors care facility in Australia. The multiple insecurities, because here we have the pandemic, elderly, vulnerable, sick people perhaps being doubly impacted both by the pandemic and by fire. If you will forgive the nasty phrasing, here is hell, but we also need to deal with high water. Because one of the things that climate change is causing is rising sea levels. And in terms of changing borders, to go back to the first terms in my title today, that's exactly what is happening as a result of the physical expansion of the ocean, both because glaciers are melting and because as water warms, it expands. And will Tuvalu actually exist at the end of the century is a real question. And this is clearly changing borders. If the waters continue to rise, Tuvalu will end up under the waves, physically removing a member state of the United Nations. And then the real question becomes, what happens to the residents of such states? Tuvalu's got a fairly small population, but presumably they are going to have to go somewhere or they drown. And so indirectly we are eliminating, or we will be, it's entirely predictable that we will be eliminating some states. And so that whole question of changing borders is not just a matter of military operations, which we're also upset about in the Ukraine, but it's also a matter of eliminating whole states, or in the case of some of the big delta of the world, in Bangladesh being obvious, being so low-lying, as waters rise, millions of people are going to end up in danger of being flooded out. 20 million climate refugees later this century is kind of figure that's being bandied around. You can make the same argument about Vietnam, because the Mekong Delta is in a similar situation. Enormously productive agricultural regions about to disappear if the flooding gets to them, can't grow the crops. Yes, there will be attempts to adapt. We will no doubt massively plant mangroves and do other things to try to prevent those borders changing. Effectively, maritime borders are going to be changing. Louisiana and Florida, bits of the north end of Alaska, not to mention the northern shorelines of Canada, are being eroded by changing sea levels and increasingly in the north of Canada, of course, the disappearance of the ice, the melting of the permafrost is a deadly combination in terms of changing our coastlines up there. This is the world in which we now live. And it's a world in which the assumptions of a stable environment need to be fairly dramatically rethought. At the heart of this is, of course, fossil fuels, but the violent response and the relationship in wars and oil are, of course, a crucial part of what I'm struggling to articulate clearly in this soon-to-be forthcoming volume. What I'm trying to think about it relates fairly explicitly to genocide studies too, because it wasn't that long ago that the Journal of Genocide Research explicitly argued that we need a paradigm shift, at least in part because we cannot operate on the assumption of stable borders that we have taken for granted as sort of the bedrock of global governance for the last, well, 75 years or so that we've had the existing United Nations. Responding, as the Indian government has done around a very substantial part of Bangladesh, in this manner, reinforcing existing borders, militarizing them, is of course one way of preventing migration. But what it ends up doing, of course, is forcing people to simply sit and take it, because the most basic human adaptation mechanism is to move away from trouble. Migration is the run away, Monty Python fans might have appreciated some years ago, is the most basic human response to danger. And if there are those nasty fences with the barbed wire and the machine guns, then that basic adaptation mechanism is being precluded. And in Chakravarty and Doyle's book, they basically argue that, you know, the global south is being told by climate experts, tough, you're just going to have to sit there and take it. And of course, taking it means large human casualties. Is this a form of indirect genocide in terms of deliberate? Well, it's not quite deliberate, but it is entirely predictable consequences of climate change for southern populations, which have not contributed a very substantial part to the climate change problem. There's a huge irony, of course, on the south end of the United States, where this fence is designed to rise and fall as the sand dunes move, so that two-legged, and many for that matter, four-legged creatures cannot cross, even as the landscape adapts to changing environmental circumstances. The fence and the barrier remains, even though the landscape is actually changing. And this seems to me to be some of the epitome of what is wrong with our attempts to think about governing a rapidly changing world using fixed boundaries. Of course, and this was a meme from a little while ago, this is a really bizarre image and it must have been photoshopped. But the argument being that actually ladders, or in this case, milk crates, are a heck of a lot cheaper than fences. And that in fact, people will find ways to cross, even if they have to do so in technical ways that are classified as illegal. Nonetheless, borders don't provide effective barriers to migration. There was a whole fuss about milk crates and border fences going around, and this is a ridiculous image, but I like it because it makes the point that ladders can be improvised a heck of a lot easier than fences can be built. And so in terms of the question of moving to deal with escaping unsustainable circumstances is going to be the human condition. And we need to stop and think very carefully about whether any notions of fences or whatever are an appropriate response in these circumstances. Clearly, those forced to move don't think so. And the crucial point is here, given what we know about the Anthropocene, given what we know about accelerating climate change, given what we know about the ecological disruptions we've already set in motion, and the backdrop to that photo or the backdrop to that person in the photo probably makes the point eloquently to everybody, is we really do now have to stop and think about how we can prepare a place for whether it's residents of Tuvalu or the Bangladesh or the Vietnam deltas can actually move. The challenge now for all of us is to address the multiple Anthropocene insecurities that is now the human context and prevent the hardening of borders, with all the dangers that that has, with genocidal consequences insofar as particular populations are refused sanctuary, they are refused mobility, and the consequences might be dire in foreseeable futures. This is why 50 years after the initial Stockholm conference and in discussing environment and in the formulation of the environment program for the United Nations, some of the folks in Stockholm have been back to think through all of this, and invited me and various colleagues, including Sanjay Chaturvedi, to engage with the discussion, because it's not one thing, climate change, or the questions of extinction, or agricultural disruptions. It's all of them happening together. And that's why this notion of Anthropocene is so important. But it also raises profound challenges to the traditional notions of governance. The assumptions of stable boundaries is no longer an assumption that makes much sense in terms of global governance. And yet the institutions that we are stuck with operate mostly on these premises. Hence the multiple insecurities which we now have to grapple with. And that is really the agenda that we all now have to stop and think about, and plan for a place for those people who are forced to move to come to safely. Failure to do so raises specters of all sorts of forms of things that, well, for want of a better term, we may simply want to call genocide. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much. That was a terrific presentation. And we do have a few questions in the Q&A that I'll get to, but also if anyone wants to raise their hand to ask a question out loud, you're welcome to do that as well. I can unmute you. But let's go to the Q&A. We have one here. They said you may answer this later in the presentation, but how do fixed boundaries of territorial states influence the ability of humanity to address issues that are global in nature, such as climate change?
The attempt at Paris, in terms of the Paris Agreement, was to use states as the entities that would solve the agreement, which each state voluntarily making a contribution to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, given the fact that that's the governance structure we have, given the fact that numerous politicians insist on sovereignty as the most important matter in global affairs, that is the institutional context we are stuck with. And yet there is no sort of effective coercive mechanism to get countries that are polluting way beyond what they ought to be, including, I regret to point out, Canada, to actually get serious about reducing their emissions. So the dysfunction of having discrete states and a global problem is just being accentuated by the failure to grapple with limiting fossil fuel use dramatically and quickly. It really is a matter of that governance structures are not fit for purpose. And this is the crisis that we currently face. All sorts of attempts to get around it with climate change, all sorts of international regulatory regimes for trade, and then, of course, questions of human rights and migration. And of course, it's precisely the migration issue that is most pressing on this one, because if people are going to stay alive in climates that are rapidly changing, migration simply is going to have to be part of the adaptation process. It's essential for residents of Tuvalu and Kiribati and the Marshall Islands and the Seychelles and various other low-lying places. It's essential for some of the residents of Florida and Louisiana, and never mind the northern shores of Canada. We have to stop and think about how we can much better accommodate the need for mobility, because in a rapidly changing world, humans are going to have to rapidly change too, and that's all about movement. That's the dilemma, and that's the one that we really do need to stop and think about. Is citizenship necessarily tied to particular geographies? I showed that slide of money going in one direction and humans going in the other. Panama and Europe, money heading for Panama because it's a tax haven. People heading for Europe because hopefully they will provide healthcare and food and succor there. But we have got to stop and think much more carefully about things like citizenship, we've got to think about what do you do about the citizenship for Tuvalu if Tuvalu disappears. Those are not easy questions. Hopefully the New Zealanders will take the population of Tuvalu, because as somebody pointed out to me decades ago, half the population of Tuvalu lives in a suburb of Auckland anyway. That's an easy one if the New Zealanders actually step up and say, we will grant, I prefer to call it Aotearoan citizenship, because the Maori name for the state is much prettier. But the point is that what are we going to do about the many millions of Bangladeshis? Some of them may actually apply for refugee status in Canada, and we'd better stop and think about it. But there are going to be many millions that will not be in a position to do that. Do we ramp up refugee camps and put a whole lot more money into the United Nations refugee system? Can't we do a little better than that in terms of facilitating migration? That is, the big governance challenge. There is no simple answer to this. And for any graduate students wanting to think about a thesis topic this time of year, get on it. This discrepancy between governance mechanisms, the taken for granted geopolitics of the world, and what needs to be done is dramatic. Much thinking needs to be done on those topics.
Thank you so much.
There is no simple answer, but there's lots of complicated policy questions and political questions that are in need of every graduate student listening to get on it.
Exactly, there you go. Another question we have here is, a lot of issues related to the Anthropocene seem to be related to the global food chain. Is there any talk about how we can address these issues without causing mass starvation?
Clearly, we're going to have to grow food differently. Clearly, we're going to have to think about ecological agriculture. We're going to have to think about what can we do to be much more productive in terms of what we grow where, but we may also have to eat a whole lot less beef simply because cows eat an awful lot of corn or other things which require large chunks of land to grow the crops that they then eat. Changing diet is going to matter in making sure that we have a robust international food system so we can move food around in terms of international trade and aid is probably going to help. But stopping and thinking about getting away from the sort of monocultural agricultural system is going to be a key part of this. It also, of course, if we can do it right, will reduce the amount of fossil fuels. If we can reduce the amount of artificial fertilizer, that too helps with climate change because it reduces the nitrous oxide emissions that come off fields where large quantities of artificial fertilizer are used. So we really do need to stop and think about how we grow food, what food we grow, and for what purpose. Because clearly we can innovate with all sorts of seed varieties. We can innovate with how we do intercropping, how we do permacultures. All sorts of innovations are possible, but they are going to have to be carefully introduced, and they may well have to require fairly dramatic changes to the political economy of food, and the major food corporations that the Cargills and all the rest of it may well have to be told dramatically to rethink their business model, and it may well be that we will all end up eating Beyond Meat instead of meat. Perhaps the whole notion of never understood why hamburgers are made of beef and called hamburgers, but never mind. Changing the whole sort of cultural politics of food too may well be what is going to need to be thought about. That's difficult to summarize, but it can be done in numerous different ways in different ecological systems. And hence, of course, the advantage is that there's a lot of flexibility possible in responding there.
Thank you so much. And we have a final question today. How does declaring a state of climate emergency change how states act in response to climate change?
Well, of course, so far it hasn't. I mean, this has been the huge problem. Environmentalists in Canada like to say to Justin Trudeau, so you declared an emergency and the day after you bought a pipeline. How does that figure? And it's something we should all be saying, because really the disconnect between recognizing we have an emergency but not thinking through the production of the stuff that's causing the emergency is a major disconnect. in terms of how policy is actually being thought about. The assumption is you can do climate change by simply dealing with consumption and forgetting about production. But if you keep pumping more and more fossil fuels into the system, well, guess what? You're not solving the problem. We need to actually think much more explicitly about, quite literally, what world we are making. Because the point about the Anthropocene is we are living in an increasingly artificial world. We are producing vast quantities of stuff, moving things around on a vast scale. And we have to do that in new ways, in different ways, dramatically reducing the amount of fossil fuels we use to power all aspects of our economies, not just the mobility bit, which of course the transportation sector is front and center on. All of those things need doing. The Canadian context, of course, Seth Klein's book called The Good War last year, or was it the year before, points to the history of the Second World War in Canada. And once the emergency of wartime was taken seriously, some careful economic planning, careful coordination between unions and corporations and governments generated an extraordinary amount of war material. The economy of Canada more or less doubled over 6 years, precisely because it was an emergency. We needed to make new and different stuff. We needed armored cars, not luxury limousines. And so we directed our productive resources and got our economy organized to do that. That is also possible, Seth Klein argues, and I would agree, if we took the notion of emergency seriously. The problem is that these declarations so far have not led to economic planning of the kind that we need. They have not led to coordinating responses across government sectors, and they have not led to, well, emergency action. So the declarations are a recognition symbolically that this is what is needed. The follow-through has yet to happen. And so the declarations are actually useful insofar as everybody said, actually, we do have a problem. It's big and it's urgent, but then other things keep intruding on the policy agenda, and we have not mobilized effectively on the basis of emergency declarations to actually follow through with what needs to be done. But on the other hand, having made the declaration, you know, the government has said this is an emergency, you can actually then make the case that, well, we need to act on it. And indeed, cities and other government agencies are increasingly beginning to do this, because they begin to realize that those floods are coming to get us if we don't get our act together. Where are we going to actually accommodate the numerous people displaced? When the next flood hits up the river, those are the kinds of emergency preparations that are increasingly getting people's attention. In British Columbia, after both the fires and then the so-called atmospheric river washed out the Coquihalla Highway this winter, folks in BC are finally beginning to think, actually, we need to stop and think much more carefully about land use planning and forestry and emergency preparedness and all of those things. We need to think about whether we actually build houses and barns for farm animals under sea level, as was the case in part of the Fraser Valley. All of those things are beginning to be focused on late in the day, but emergencies require those kinds of responses. What worries me, and what is we've really got to be careful about, is that we don't fall back on old models of governance here. We need to think imaginatively and innovatively. What we really do not need to do is turn people forced to move as a result of climate change into threats. Migration across our frontiers is going to be part of the future if we see them as threats to our way of life or our culture, and then we close the gates and put the ammunition belts and the machine guns. We really are in a dystopian future, which we have to stop and think about. And of course, if one thinks about emergencies in terms of suspending democratic rights, using military means, then we're not heading in a direction that any of us want to go. And that's the downside of emergency declarations. So we have to be very careful that we get the right emergency responses, not the traditional security, close the borders, the foreigners are a threat kind of response, because if we get that, we're in for a really messy, dystopic, shall I say, genocidal future.
Right. It's so scary to think about. Well, thank you so much, Professor Dalby. This was such a fascinating presentation, and thank you for the participants for joining us today and for your questions. Before we sign off, if you missed any of today's session, we are recording it. So it will be available on our website if you want to go back and re-listen to some parts or note down some of the resources. I know my colleague Allison will be sending you a few resources in the chat. And we'll also send you the recording and some resources in an email afterwards as well. And I'd like to say thank you for all of the people who joined all of the sessions. This is our last one of this series, but again, we hope to do another series in the future. But if you have missed any of the past sessions, those are also available on our website. And you can stay up to date on all of Zorian Institute's work on our website and on our social media platforms. So thank you again for everyone who's tuned in. And thank you, Professor Dalby, again for this presentation. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and take care, everyone.